Hello, hello. Welcome back to Mistress of the Damned. I am your Mistress Katrina. How are you doing today? If you are new here, welcome. This is where I am reading through my enormous library of books, giving you a quick synopsis, reviewing the book, letting you know what I think of it, and then hopefully you'll read it and make up your own mind. So if you like books, just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, let me know what you think in the comments. It is the last Monday of the month, which means it is time for the next president, James Madison. This month's book, I had in my collection already. I got it when my day job had me TDY in Washington, D.C., and I day tripped out to Montpelier. James and Dolley Madison by Bruce Chadwick. Now, I kind of messed up in picking this book. All right, I already had it in my collection. That's why I read it. I'm like, oh, I already have a book on James Madison. Well, not quite. It's James and Dolley Madison, and this is my fault. There's very little biographical information about James Madison in the book, and that's on me. I should have vetted this better. This book is not my favorite, which I'm going to get to in a minute, and I don't think it's fair for me to say, well, James Madison's not my favorite president, because I don't know. There just wasn't enough information in here for me to make that sort of determination. So here's what is in the book. James Madison met Dolly Payne Todd in 1793 after she was widowed in a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Dolly was very much a social butterfly, very extroverted. She genuinely liked people and had many prospects for the widow Todd's hand. All right, she was very popular. A lot of gentlemen wanted to meet her. And I think James heard about her and from his friend Aaron Burr. Yes. It's all very internet-seen, right? All of early politics today is very, very interlinked. It's who you know, not if you actually do a good job. But anyways, it was the same back then, too. So James Madison heard about her from Aaron Burr and wanted to meet her. And so Aaron Burr went ahead and arranged this meeting between them. Now, for James, at least, I think it was probably love at first sight, because Dolly was very charming. She was very beautiful. Everybody, like I said, very social, very outgoing, very extroverted. She was one of those, gifted social people who remembered everybody she met, remembered their details, their names, their families, their children's birth dates, things like that. And these things make you very likable, right? Being able to connect with somebody like that makes you incredibly likable. And so James was, I think, love at first sight. Dolly was at least charmed by him. Now, at the time, James Madison was 43. She was 25, so there's almost a 20-year age gap between them. And this is kind of an opposites attract sort of case, because he was not very extroverted. I don't know that he's what we would call an introvert today, because apparently once you got to know him, he was very lively, but very few people took the chance to get to know him past his initially shy demeanor. Dolly took the time to get to know him, and she was at least charmed by him, and willing for the acquaintance to continue until it was a love match, and they married in 1794. Now, immediately after marrying, Madison retired from Congress and was basically happy to stay at home running Montpelier. But when Thomas Jefferson was elected as president in 1800, with the term starting 1801, Jefferson asked Madison to be his Secretary of State, which position Madison filled for all 8 years that Jefferson was in office. Now, once they hit D.C., Dolly essentially stepped in and acted as the White House hostess through all of Jefferson's presidency. I think most historians will say that because Jefferson was widowed, and of course Sally Hemings would not have been a suitable first lady, being that she was black, a slave, his mistress, he needed somebody who was socially acceptable, so he asked Dolly to step in and be the White House hostess. Most historians say that the first lady, such as it is, was his oldest daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. But she really wasn't at the White House that much, all right? When she was in town, Dolly would step back and let her hostess and be the leader. But by and large, it was Dolly who ran things for the 8 years that Madison was Secretary of State, and then the 8 years that Madison was president. And I think Chadwick makes a pretty strong case that Madison might not have been elected president had it not been for Dolly's politicking, because she was a consummate hostess. I mean, she never dropped a ball, invited everyone to parties across across the political lines. So it didn't matter which side of the spectrum you were on, didn't matter, who you voted or who you supported, you were welcome at the White House. And she made them feel welcome. And so that sort of politicking got Madison elected twice, including for his second term during the War of 1812, when he was not the most likely candidate because the war was so unpopular. And that's pretty much all I really know about the War of 1812, which is interesting because that was kind of the defining element of Madison's presidency, right? I mean, we had Washington was the first, Adams managed to keep us out of war with France and England. Jefferson got the Louisiana Purchase. Madison had the War of 1812, and he was the first wartime president we had because Washington, there was no war. The Revolution was ended. Adams kept us out of war. Jefferson kept us out of war. Madison jumped into the War of 1812. The other thing that I learned is, in addition to him not being necessarily popular because there was strong pushback from the opposite party, was that the reason we went into the War of 1812 was impressment, which what that means is essentially when our ships were on the seas, the British would overtake them and then claim a good chunk of the sailors as being British citizens, and so then they would impress them into service and basically kidnap American sailors to make them work for the British. And that's certainly a valid complaint. I think he had a good point getting us into the War of 1812. The other thing I learned is that he was, as a wartime president, he had an absolute shit army. The army essentially failed at every battle it ever fought until he sent Jackson down to New Orleans. But the Navy was freaking impressive. And Chadwick gives Madison a lot of credit for the Navy, but the Navy was really Adams' doing. Adams is the one who pushed to build up a strong naval presence, and that was allowed to lapse during Jefferson's presidency so that it was kind of actually weak when Madison took over. If Jefferson had actually kept those levels high, we probably would have been in a better position. But the Navy kicked some serious ass during the War of 1812. I mean, seriously impressive. Enough so that I feel like I need a different book just for the War of 1812, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Right now, I'm still just working on the presidency. So, that was more of a rant than I meant to go on, but anyways, Dolley loved everybody. So, okay, for an example, several years ago, way before I started this channel, I read a book by Malcolm Gladwell, although, fuck if I can remember which one it was, but he talks about influencers basically, and this is even before the concept became big with social media, YouTube, Instagram, all of that, but like actual real life influencers, people who like to make connections between people, and that was Dolley. Dolley was definitely one who liked to make connections. She was so good at it, got so many people political seats and positions that they might never have aspired to, that after James Madison died, Congress voted to keep a seat open for her to sit in on congressional meetings until her death. And it wasn't just her ability to connect people and influence. Her mind was that keen that when she spoke on political topics, they would listen to her. And that's remarkable for a woman in the 19th century to be given that level of accord. But she had definitely proven her political chops, if you will. She was very widely read. She read all the newspapers. She had an enormous library of her own prior to marrying Madison, and then when they married, their library got bigger. That's just kind of how far-reaching her political influence went and how good she was as a political creature, which, again, completely remarkable in the 19th century for anybody, but especially so that she was a woman, and that was very much a man's world at the time. So anyways, Dolley's a networking queen. She worked her network magic to swing a presidency for her husband, who served 2 terms, 1809 to 1817, before retiring to Montpelier for good, where he died in 1836. And that's basically the summary of the book. It was a bit repetitious. There are no less than 3 full chapters about the parties that Dolley would host at the White House and at Montpelier, and then they were frequently referenced in other chapters. I mean, by far the most interesting chapter, and it's what made me go, oh, okay, this is probably a really good book, was chapter 1, where the author describes Dolley Madison's flight from the White House during the War of 1812, wherein she saved the portrait of George Washington, right? Famous moment in American history. Dolley Madison saves the portrait of George Washington while fleeing a burning White House. Just, like I said, everything was just repetitious. The repetition of the party, repetition of the reason for the War of 1812 being that impressment of American sailors, James Madison's social awkwardness, which I get that he was probably shy, but I'm not sure if it's accurately portrayed because the man was chosen out of all the delegates at the Constitutional Convention to write the Constitution. I mean, you got to have some ability to talk to people to be selected out of that, and I don't know what that is. I don't know why he was chosen for it. None of that information was included in this book. I mean, other than explaining Dolley's role in getting him the presidency, the author makes some pretty sweeping assertions, none of which he actually proves. He asserts that Madison's owning of slaves were why their finances ultimately failed, leaving Dolley bankrupt in the end. Ultimately, she ended up selling Madison's papers, and he was a prolific writer. She ended up selling them to Congress for a sum probably less than they were actually worth, because she did trust her son, and there's another point I'm going to get to here, to sell them to a publisher in New York, and he kept fucking up the deal, basically. And so she ended up selling them to Congress. Congress, God love them, actually did something good for their one true citizen that they absolutely adored, which is they refused to give the money directly to her son. They're like, no, we're going to give this to Dolley. We're not giving this to you to act as intermediary. You're a waste of space. Every single thing that he uses to explain the financial difficulties of the Madisons point towards an inability to say no to Dolley's very spoiled son from her first marriage and their own profligacy. They spent money. Dolley had an absolutely enormous wardrobe, some of which was given to her as gifts, but she was the trendsetter of the day. People, oh my God, my makeup's, boy, I really fucked that up. But, I mean, she was the trendsetter of the day. She set the fashion. She set the tone. She was the influencer of Washington, D.C., all right? And she spent a lot of money to do it. Slavery is evil, unquestionably. I think even James Madison knew that. But this author's trying to say, oh, it was all slavery's fault, when really there's no indication of that even in his own writing, right? What's proven is that they were unable to say no to friends and family who would come to them and say, hey, I need money to pay X bills, and they would just pay their bills, leaving nothing for them. So that Dolley ultimately ended up selling Montpelier for kind of a cut-rate price so that she could live on the house they owned in D.C., and that's where she ended up going to after James died. Chadwick asserts that Payne Todd, who is Dolley's remaining son from her first marriage, was a sociopath, but he doesn't convince. There's a far simpler explanation than sociopathy for Todd's problems. When Dolley was widowed in 1793, her oldest son, William, I believe, died in the same epidemic on the same day as her husband, from the same epidemic. So Dolley became, I think that following this, Dolley became an overbearing mother. She was set on drowning her youngest son in love and making sure, in protective layers, and making sure that he was always okay. This urge was probably compounded by the fact that Madison was apparently sterile. They never had children of their own, so that Payne Todd was their only child, essentially. Only child of a rich Southern planter who I think was spoiled within an inch of his life, never given a chance to fail. Anytime he did fail, Mommy and Daddy bailed his ass out, which is a problem we see today, right? Kids aren't allowed to fail anymore. But I think that just led to apathy. And I don't think he was a sociopath. I think he could just never get away from his mother's influence because of how broadly social she was. First in Philadelphia, then in the White House, connections up and down the seaboard. I mean, everybody knew who Dolley was, and so no matter where he went, there were people looking out for him. All right, people bailing him out for Mommy and Daddy because they knew that Mommy and Daddy would pay them back. Even when he was sent to overseas postings, she had people overseas who knew him and would protect his dumb ass. So he just was a spoiled brat. It was never expected to grow up. Interestingly enough, the strongest argument against Payne being a sociopath is literally the last line in the book. Quote, during his last days, talking about his relationship to his parents, Payne Todd told a friend that throughout his life he had been his own worst enemy. I mean, when has a sociopath ever been that self-reflective? All right? Like I said, the book did not persuade. Now, the fact that this is not an awesome biography on Madison is not necessarily the author's fault. It is exactly what it says it is. It is a book describing the relationship between James and Dolley Madison. So I learned a good lesson on vetting my books better. This book would have been better if the author had included a bit more biography on each of them individually before they ever met. I mean, James was 42. Literally half his life was gone when they met. So The book picking up and only describing his life from that point forward leaves out huge bits of highly relevant history and limits James' life to the 16 years he was in and around the White House, first as Secretary of State and then as president. I mean, it sort of glosses over his 20 years of retirement before his death. So in a life of 85 years, the author focused on 16, and then only haphazardly, focusing more on Dolley's parties rather than on Madison's contributions to governments. So I'm disappointed in this one. I still don't feel like I know enough about Madison to determine where he ranks on my list of presidents, so I'm going to read a different book on Madison next month. We'll just kind of move everything out a month. So we're going to do James Madison again next month. And that's it for this week on Mistress of the Damned. This is the channel where we believe all knowledge is worth having and freedom of speech is the most important right, which is why it is first. If you agree with those principles, then you are damned, and I am your mistress. Thanks for watching. Bye.